The morning sun filtered through the curtains as Eleanor Winters slowly moved around her bedroom. At 90 years old, her body didn't work as quickly as her mind still did. Today was special. She and Harold were celebrating 70 years of marriage, a milestone few couples ever reached. "Harold," she called out, her voice still strong despite her age. "Have you seen my pearl earrings?" There was no answer. Her husband of 7 decades was probably in the garden, tending to his beloved roses. Even at 92, Harold maintained his daily routines with surprising energy. Eleanor smiled as she opened her jewelry box. 70 years together. They had built a good life. 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and now 2 great-grandchildren. The family would all gather this afternoon for a celebration at their daughter Martha's home. For the anniversary display, Eleanor wanted to arrange old photographs showing their long journey together. She made her way slowly to Harold's study, where they kept the family albums. The room smelled of his pipe tobacco and old books, a scent she had come to love over the years. As she pulled the photo albums from the bottom drawer of his desk, her hand brushed against something hard at the back. Curious, Eleanor reached deeper and pulled out a metal box she had never seen before. It was locked, but the key was taped to its bottom, clearly not meant to be a serious barrier. "What's this?" she murmured to herself. In all their years sharing this house, she had never noticed this box. That alone made her heart beat a little faster. Eleanor sat in Harold's leather chair and turned the small key in the lock. The box opened with a soft click. Inside were documents, old, yellowed papers carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Her eyes widened as she lifted the first document. It was a birth certificate, but not Harold's. At least, not Harold Winters. This certificate was for someone named Heinrich Weber, born in Munich, Germany, on March 15, 1933, the same birth date as Harold's. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she examined the other papers. Military documents, immigration forms, none for Harold Winters, all for Heinrich Weber. And strangest of all, a death certificate for Harold Winters dated May 1945, a full 2 years before she had met her husband. A photograph slipped from between the papers. A young man in a uniform she didn't recognize, with eyes she knew better than her own. Harold's eyes. The sound of the back door closing startled her. Harold was coming in from the garden. Quickly, Eleanor returned everything to the box except the photograph, which she slipped into her pocket. She locked the box and put it back where she found it, then pulled out the photo albums she had originally come for. "Ellie, are you in here?" Harold's voice called from the hallway. "Yes, dear. Just getting the albums for the party," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. Harold appeared in the doorway, his face weathered but still handsome, a few fresh roses in his hand. "I thought these might look nice on your dress," he said, smiling at her with the same warmth he had shown for 70 years. Eleanor accepted the flowers with a forced smile. For the first time in their marriage, she felt like she was looking at a stranger. Who was this man she had shared her life with? And what other secrets might be hiding behind those familiar blue eyes? She decided to wait. The family would be arriving soon. Today was for celebration, but soon, very soon, she would need answers about the man she thought she knew completely. The anniversary celebration at Martha's house was beautiful, but Eleanor could hardly focus. Every time she looked at Harold across the room, laughing with their grandchildren or accepting congratulations, the image of that strange photograph burned in her pocket. "Mom, are you feeling all right?" Martha asked, touching her mother's arm. "You've barely touched your cake." Eleanor patted her daughter's hand. "Just tired, dear. 90 years old isn't young, you know." But it wasn't age weighing on her. It was the growing fear that the man she had loved for 7 decades might be someone else entirely. When they returned home that evening, Harold helped Eleanor out of the car with the same gentle care he always showed. His hands were spotted with age but still strong. Those hands had held hers through births, deaths, joys, and sorrows. Could they also be hiding terrible secrets? "That was a wonderful party," Harold said as they settled in their living room. "I can't believe they got all the great-grandchildren to behave for the photos." Eleanor nodded, barely hearing him. The box in his study called to her like a siren. Finally, she couldn't bear it any longer. "Harold," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I found something today that I don't understand." His smile faded slightly. "What's that, dear?" Eleanor pulled the photograph from her pocket. I found this in a metal box in your desk drawer, along with some papers for someone named Heinrich Weber. The color drained from Harold's face. For a moment, he looked much older than his 92 years. His mouth opened, then closed, as if words failed him. It was just some old paperwork. He finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The birth date on those papers matched yours, Harold. And there was a death certificate for Harold Winters from 1945, 2 years before I met you. Eleanor's hands were shaking now. Who is Heinrich Weber? Harold's eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal's. Please, Ellie, it's nothing. Just some old documents. They don't mean anything. They must mean something if you've kept them hidden all these years, Eleanor pressed. She had never seen her husband look so frightened. Harold stood up suddenly, his legs unsteady. I need to take my medicine, he muttered, moving toward the kitchen. Eleanor followed him. Harold, please. We've been married for 70 years. There shouldn't be secrets between us. Some things are better left in the past, he snapped, surprising her with his harsh tone. Harold never spoke to her that way. Just leave it alone, Eleanor. She watched as he fumbled with his pill container, his hands trembling so badly that pills scattered across the counter. This wasn't just the nervousness of a man caught in a small lie. This was terror. That night, Eleanor lay awake beside the man she had shared a bed with for 70 years. His breathing told her he wasn't sleeping either. For the first time in their marriage, a wall stood between them, built of secrets and lies. The next morning, Eleanor called their granddaughter Sarah. Of all their grandchildren, Sarah had inherited Eleanor's determination and curiosity. As a journalist, she knew how to find information. Grandma, is everything okay? Sarah asked when she picked up. I need your help with something, Eleanor said quietly, watching Harold gardening through the window. But you can't tell anyone else in the family yet. Not until we know more. Know more about what? Eleanor took a deep breath. About who your grandfather really is. Sarah arrived at her grandparents' house the following afternoon, laptop tucked under her arm. At 32, she had built a solid reputation as an investigative journalist. Never had she imagined using those skills to investigate her own grandfather. Grandpa's at his weekly chess game at the park. Eleanor explained as she ushered Sarah inside. We have about 3 hours. Eleanor had prepared the dining room table with the mysterious metal box. She'd retrieved it from Harold's study while he was napping earlier that day, her heart pounding with each creak of the floorboards. So this is everything? Sarah asked, carefully lifting the birth certificate for Heinrich Weber. Her journalist's eyes immediately noticed details that Eleanor had missed. Look at this watermark, she said, holding the document up to the light. And these official stamps. These aren't forgeries, Grandma. These are authentic German documents from the 1930s and 40s. Eleanor sank into a chair. But how can that be? Your grandfather has always been Harold Winters. He told me he grew up in Connecticut, that he served in the American Army during the war. Sarah spread out more documents from the box. According to these papers, Heinrich Weber was born in Munich in 1933. There's military paperwork here too, but it's not American. She studied the German text carefully. Grandma, this appears to be documentation for service in the... Sarah paused, her face growing pale. In the Schutzstaffel, the SS. The what? Eleanor asked, though a cold feeling was spreading through her chest. Hitler's Elite Guard, the worst of the Nazi forces. Sarah's voice had dropped to a whisper. Eleanor shook her head firmly. That's impossible. Harold is kind. He's gentle. He's donated to Jewish charities for decades. Sarah continued sorting through the papers, her professional demeanor slipping as she uncovered more documents. Here's immigration paperwork. And... She stopped suddenly, holding a document with trembling hands. What is it? Eleanor asked. It's a death certificate for Harold Winters, an American soldier who died in Germany in May 1945. Sarah looked up. And here's an American birth certificate for Harold, citizenship papers, all dated after this death certificate. Eleanor stared at the papers spread across her dining room table, evidence that the man she had loved for 70 years had stolen someone else's identity, someone who had died in the war. We need to find out more about both of them, Sarah said, opening her laptop. About Heinrich Weber and the real Harold Winters. While Sarah typed rapidly, searching through online archives, Eleanor moved to the living room where old photo albums lined the bookshelves. She pulled down their earliest album, pictures from their first years together. She studied Harold's young face in their wedding photo. Had she ever really known this man? "Grandma," Sarah called from the dining room, her voice strained. "I found something." Eleanor returned to find her granddaughter staring at the screen. "I've accessed some war archives through my press credentials." There was a Heinrich Weber listed as a guard at a concentration camp in 1944. Sarah swallowed hard. "And I found a military photograph." She turned the laptop so Eleanor could see. The black and white image showed a young man in Nazi uniform, younger than in Eleanor's wedding photos, but unmistakably the same person. The same eyes. The same small scar above his right eyebrow that Harold had always claimed came from falling off a bicycle as a boy. "It's him," Eleanor whispered, her legs suddenly weak. She gripped the table to steady herself. "There's more," Sarah said quietly. The real Harold Winters was a Jewish-American soldier. The room seemed to spin around Eleanor. For 70 years, she had slept beside, loved, and built a life with a man who had hidden his involvement in the most horrific genocide in history, and he had stolen the identity of one of its victims. "We need to talk to him," Eleanor said, her voice finding new strength. "I need to know who I really married." Eleanor couldn't sleep that night. Harold's soft snoring beside her, once comforting, now sounded like the ticking of a bomb. Every breath, every movement from the man she thought she knew made her flinch. By morning, Harold knew something was wrong. He watched Eleanor over breakfast, his watery blue eyes concerned behind his glasses. "You're upset about those papers," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor set down her teacup carefully. "I need to clean out the attic today," she replied, ignoring his comment. "Martha wants some of the old baby clothes for her granddaughter." Harold nodded slowly, clearly confused by her change of subject. "I'll be in the garden if you need help." As soon as Harold disappeared outside, Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. But she wasn't looking for baby clothes. During the night, she had remembered something. A toolbox Harold never let anyone touch, tucked away in the darkest corner of the attic. The old wooden floorboards creaked under her feet as she made her way to the back. There it was, covered in dust. The lock was simple, and Eleanor found that the same key that had opened the metal box also opened this one. Her husband had not been very creative with his hiding places. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a bundle of letters, all written in German, all yellowed with age. Eleanor couldn't read them, but the dates were clear: 1944, 1945, 1946. And something else caught her eye, a small black book with an eagle symbol stamped on its cover. Her hands trembling, Eleanor took her discoveries downstairs. She called Sarah immediately. "I found more," she said when her granddaughter answered. "Letters in German and a book with a Nazi symbol." Sarah arrived within the hour. While she examined the new findings, Eleanor watched Harold through the window. He looked so ordinary, kneeling by his roses, his old hands gently tending the soil. How could those same hands have done terrible things? "Grandma," Sarah's voice pulled Eleanor back. "These letters are from a woman named Greta. From what I can translate, she seems to be his sister." Eleanor sat down heavily. "Harold told me he was an only child." She's writing about their parents being questioned after the war, about how scared she is. Sarah flipped through more pages. She's begging him to stay away, saying it's not safe for him to come back. Sarah turned to the small black book. "And this is a Nazi Party membership booklet." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I don't understand. How could I not know? How could I live with someone for 70 years and not know who he really was?" A noise at the doorway made them both turn. Harold stood there, his gardening hat in his hands, soil still under his fingernails. His face was ashen as he stared at the items spread across the kitchen table. "You've been in the attic," he said. It wasn't a question. "Who are you?" Eleanor asked, her voice stronger than she felt. "Who are you really?" Harold's eyes moved from Eleanor to Sarah, then back to his wife. "I wanted to tell you so many times," he said, his voice breaking. "When we got engaged, on our wedding day, when each child was born, but I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Sarah demanded. Afraid of being caught for what you did? Harold's face crumpled. Yes, he whispered. And afraid of losing the only good thing in my life, your grandmother. Were you at the camp? Eleanor asked directly. The concentration camp listed in those records. Harold lowered himself slowly into a chair, suddenly looking every day of his 92 years. Yes, he admitted, a tear rolling down his weathered cheek. I was there. I did things. Things I've spent my whole life trying to forget. And Harold Winters? Sarah pressed. The real one? An American soldier, Harold confirmed. He died during the final days of the war. I took his papers. I became him. Eleanor felt the room spinning. 70 years of marriage. 3 children, a lifetime of memories, all built on a terrible lie. Tell me everything, she said. I want the whole truth now. No more secrets. The kitchen fell silent except for the steady ticking of the old wall clock. Eleanor, Sarah, and Harold sat around the table where countless family meals had been shared. Now it held evidence of a dark past, letters in German, Nazi documentation, and the stolen identity papers of a dead American soldier. Start from the beginning, Eleanor said, her voice surprisingly calm. 70 years of marriage had taught her patience, even in moments of crisis. Harold's hands trembled as he reached for a glass of water. I was born Heinrich Weber in Munich in 1933. My father was an early supporter of Hitler's party. By the time I was 10, it was all I knew. Sarah pulled out her phone and began recording. When Harold glanced at her questioningly, she didn't back down. This is history, Grandpa, or whoever you are. It needs to be preserved. Harold nodded wearily. At 17, I was assigned to a camp. Not the death camps you hear about most often, but still. He closed his eyes briefly. Still a place of horror. I was a guard. I followed orders. What kind of orders? Eleanor asked, her face pale but composed. Harold stared at his hands. I helped process new arrivals. I stood watch over work details. His voice broke. I turned away when people were beaten. I pretended not to hear screams at night. Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth, but she didn't cry. And after the war? When Germany fell, I ran. Many of us did. I was young enough that I could pass as a refugee myself. Harold's eyes held a faraway look. I was hiding in a bombed-out farmhouse when an American patrol came through. There was gunfire. From local German holdouts, not me. When it was over, 1 American was dead. Harold Winters, Sarah said, her voice hard. Harold nodded. He was alone, separated from his unit. I took his identification, his uniform. I studied his papers and learned his story. I made myself into him. And came to America, Eleanor finished. Yes, I traveled with a group of real refugees to a processing center. From there, I made my way to Connecticut, where Harold was from. I started a new life. Where you met Grandma, Sarah said. Where I met Eleanor, Harold confirmed, looking at his wife with eyes full of pain. I never expected to fall in love. I was just trying to survive, to hide. But then there was you, he said directly to Eleanor. Beautiful, kind, full of life. I told myself I would become the man you deserved. Eleanor's composure finally cracked. You lied to me every day for 70 years. Not about loving you, Harold pleaded. Never about that, or about loving our children, our family. But you were. Eleanor couldn't bring herself to say the word. A Nazi, Sarah finished for her grandmother. You were part of the regime that murdered millions of innocent people. Harold's shoulders sagged. Yes, I was raised in that evil. I participated in it. I can never undo that. All those Jewish charities you donated to, Eleanor said suddenly. The Holocaust Memorial Fund that you insisted we support every year. My pathetic attempt at atonement, Harold admitted. I've spent 70 years trying to be a good man, to balance the scales somehow. There is no balancing those scales, Sarah said sharply. Harold nodded. I know, nothing can make up for what I was part of. Eleanor stood suddenly, her small frame rigid with anger and grief. I need to think. I can't be in this house right now. Ellie, please. Harold reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Don't touch me, she said, her voice breaking. I don't know who you are. Sarah stood and put her arm around her grandmother. You can stay with me, Grandma. As they moved toward the door, Harold called out one last time, his voice cracking with age and emotion. "Eleanor, what I became with you, that was the real me. The man you knew for 70 years. That's who I really am." Eleanor paused at the doorway, but didn't turn around. "The man I knew never existed," she said quietly, and then she was gone. For 5 days, Eleanor stayed at Sarah's apartment in the city. She slept in the guest room, though slept was hardly the right word. Most nights she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying 70 years of memories with new, terrible knowledge. "You should eat something, Grandma," Sarah said, placing a bowl of soup on the coffee table. Eleanor sat wrapped in a blanket, looking smaller than Sarah had ever seen her. "How can I make sense of this?" Eleanor asked, not touching the soup. "The father of my children was a Nazi. The man who held my hand through 3 childbirths, who nursed me through cancer, who remembered every anniversary with flowers. That man helped imprison innocent people." Sarah sat beside her grandmother. As a journalist, she dealt in facts and truth, but this truth was crushing someone she loved. "I've been doing some research," Sarah said carefully, "about what happens in cases like this." Eleanor looked up. "There are other cases. More than you'd think. Nazi guards and officers who escaped to America, Canada, South America. When they're discovered, they're typically deported to face trial. At 92, Eleanor shook her head. Harold would die before any trial began. "Probably," Sarah agreed. "But don't you think justice matters? Those people in the camp never got to grow old." Eleanor's phone buzzed with another call from Martha. Her daughter had called multiple times, confused about why her mother had suddenly moved in with Sarah and wasn't taking calls from Harold. "What do I tell the family?" Eleanor asked, ignoring the call. "That their father, their grandfather, was a monster?" "Was he?" Sarah asked. "I mean, yes, what he did was monstrous. But the man who taught me to ride a bike, who came to every one of my school plays, who cried at my college graduation, was that person a monster too?" Eleanor was surprised to hear Sarah, who had been the angriest, now sounding uncertain. "I've been thinking about something else," Sarah continued. "I found records of large donations to Holocaust survivor funds going back decades. All anonymous, but the amounts and timing match withdrawals from Grandpa's accounts that I found in his papers." Eleanor wasn't surprised. "Harold always insisted on our charitable giving. He said it was our duty to help others." Was that guilt, or real change? Sarah wondered. That night, Eleanor received a call from their family doctor. Harold had suffered a small stroke. He was stable but weak. The doctor didn't say it directly, but his message was clear. At Harold's age, time was short. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked after Eleanor hung up. Eleanor stood at the window, watching the city lights. "I don't know. Part of me wants to never see him again. Part of me wants to rush to his side. How can both feelings exist together?" "Because it's complicated," Sarah said. "Because humans are complicated." Eleanor turned to face her granddaughter. "There's something else I've been thinking about. If we report him, it becomes public. The whole family will know. Your cousins, their children. Everyone will carry this stain." "Is that a reason to hide the truth?" "No," Eleanor said firmly. "But it's a consequence we have to consider. The truth doesn't just affect Harold. It affects all of us." Eleanor packed her small suitcase that night. When Sarah saw, her eyes widened in surprise. "You're going back to him?" "I'm going back to my home," Eleanor corrected, "to decide what to do face to face. I've spent 70 years looking into those eyes. I need to look into them once more, knowing everything, before I can make my choice." The house was quiet when Eleanor returned. Too quiet. For 70 years, there had always been some sign of Harold's presence. The radio playing old jazz in his study, the soft tap of his cane, or the distinct smell of his pipe tobacco. Now, the silence felt heavy. She found him in their bedroom, propped up against pillows. The stroke had affected the left side of his face, pulling his mouth into a slight droop. His once strong hands lay limp on the blanket. The home health nurse the doctor had arranged nodded respectfully to Eleanor before slipping out to give them privacy. "You came back," Harold whispered, his speech slightly slurred. Eleanor set her bag down and sat in the chair beside the bed. Not too close, but not as far as she could have been. "I came home," she corrected. "This is still my home." Harold's eyes filled with tears. Eleanor. I. She held up her hand. No, I'm going to talk now. You spent 70 years hiding the truth. Now you will listen. For a moment, she saw a flash of the old Harold, the slight nod, the respectful silence when she had something important to say. It made her heart ache. Sarah found more information. Eleanor began. About Heinrich Weber. About the camp. About what happened there. Harold closed his eyes, as if bracing himself. She also found your bank records, the donations, thousands of dollars, every year since 1952, to Holocaust survivors' funds, to Jewish charities, to memorial museums. Eleanor leaned forward. Why? Harold's eyes opened, red-rimmed and weary. Because I could never forget, because I needed to do something, anything. Was it just guilt? At first, he admitted. But then, it became more. I read survivors' stories. I learned what they went through, what people like me put them through. I couldn't undo the past, but I could try to help heal the future. Eleanor thought of their children, their grandchildren. Harold had taught them all about kindness, about standing up for what was right. Had that been his way of ensuring they would never follow the path he once had? I've been thinking about who you are, Eleanor said carefully. Not who you were in Germany, but who you've been for 70 years. The man who stayed by my side through everything. The man who taught our son to stand up to bullies. The man who marched for civil rights in the 60s when our neighbors wouldn't. I was trying to be better, Harold said, to be worthy of you, of the life I stole. You stole more than a life, Eleanor reminded him. You stole justice from those who deserved it. Harold nodded weakly. I know, and I've waited every day for someone to come for me, for the past to finally catch up. Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a folder of papers. Sarah's research, evidence of Heinrich Weber's past, enough to alert authorities. I could turn you in, she said, even now. You should, Harold whispered. You should. Eleanor looked at the man in the bed, not the young Nazi guard from the photographs, not even the handsome American veteran she had married, but the weathered, repentant old man who had spent far more years trying to do good than he had doing evil. I don't forgive what you did back then, Eleanor said firmly. I can't forgive that. It's not mine to forgive. I know, Harold said, but I know who you became. I know the man who has been my husband. And that man, her voice caught, that man I still love. Eleanor reached for Harold's hand, her first voluntary touch since discovering the truth. His fingers curled weakly around hers. We don't have much time left, she said, looking at his frail form. Whatever you did, whatever happens next, I'll be here. We'll face it together. Harold's tears fell freely now. I don't deserve you, Eleanor. I never did. No, she agreed, with the honesty of 70 years together. You've had me all the same. 3 weeks after Eleanor returned home, Harold passed away quietly in his sleep. His hand was in hers, just as it had been almost every night for 70 years. Despite knowing the truth, she felt his absence like a physical pain, a space beside her that would never be filled again. The funeral was simple but well attended. Their children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren gathered, along with neighbors and friends from their many decades in the community. Harold was remembered as a kind man, a devoted husband, a loving father, and a generous community member. Only Eleanor and Sarah knew the full truth. They had agreed, after many late-night conversations, to keep Harold's secret. Not to protect him, but to protect the family who had never known Heinrich Weber, only Harold Winters. He was a good father, Martha said at the reception after the funeral, her eyes red from crying. I keep thinking about how he taught me to ride a bike, how patient he was. Eleanor squeezed her daughter's hand. He loved you very much. As people shared memories of Harold, Eleanor noticed something striking. No one mentioned a harsh word, an act of cruelty, or a moment of prejudice. The man they described was consistently kind, fair, and thoughtful. Had he spent his entire American life trying to be the opposite of who he had been in Germany? 1 week after the funeral, Sarah came to visit. She found Eleanor in Harold's study, sorting through his belongings. How are you doing, Grandma? Sarah asked, helping her lift a heavy box of books. I found his will, Eleanor said, and a letter he wrote to me years ago, to be opened after his death. What did it say? Sarah asked gently. that he had left nearly all our savings to the Holocaust Memorial Museum and to funds for survivors and their families. Eleanor showed Sarah the documents. Almost $2 million. Sarah's eyes widened. That's almost everything he had. Yes, he'd been investing carefully for decades, it seems. Eleanor touched the papers gently. His letter explained that it was never enough, but it was all he could do. Did he? Did he confess in the letter? Sarah asked. Yes, the full truth. He wanted me to have it written down, in his own words. Eleanor looked up at her granddaughter. He also wrote that I should decide whether to make it public or not. And what have you decided? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. I've decided to donate the money as he wished, anonymously. And I've decided to volunteer at the Holocaust Education Center in the city. And his confession will stay between us for now. Eleanor stood up, suddenly looking stronger than she had in weeks. But I'm going to write everything down, his story, my story, what we discovered. After I'm gone, you can decide what to do with it. Sarah hugged her grandmother tightly. I think that's wise. In the months that followed, Eleanor immersed herself in Holocaust education work. Without revealing her personal connection, she helped organize survivor speaking events and educational programs for schools. Sometimes, when she looked at photographs of camp guards, she would search for young Heinrich's face among them. She never found him, but she knew he had been there, part of the machinery of hatred that had destroyed so many lives. On what would have been their 71st anniversary, Eleanor visited Harold's grave. She placed roses from his garden beside the simple headstone. I'm still angry with you, she whispered to the quiet cemetery. I still love you. Both things are true. As she walked away, Eleanor felt strangely at peace. She had lived most of her life alongside a man with a terrible secret. But she had also lived with a man who had spent 7 decades trying to be better than his worst self. In the complex calculus of a lifetime, she could hold both truths in her heart. For Eleanor, there would be no simple ending to their story. Only the complicated truth that humans can be both terrible and good, that redemption is never complete, and that love, even when built on lies, can still be real.